Alright, howdy folks, welcome back to the channel. Today we are going to take a look at this upcoming DLC for Gates of Hell called Scorched Earth. I have a link to store page for it down in the description, and I hope actually to be able to show some early access gameplay of this new DLC before its public release. But I figured since that's probably still a little while away, we might as well take a look at this together and see what's inside. So unlike the latest Sdkfz DLC, which added Finland as a nation, this seems to mostly focus on new units, missions, and multiplayer doctrines for the Soviets and Germans. I will say that Sdkfz was seen as relatively expensive, so I'm hoping this will be a little bit on the cheaper side, seeing as it's not going to be adding a whole faction that's usable in multiplayer, campaigns, and conquest. So Scorched Earth will come with 4 new Soviet and 4 new German campaign missions, 6 new multiplayer doctrines for both the Soviets and the Germans, with there being 1 doctrine per faction per time period, so 1 for early, 1 for middle, and 1 for late. More than 30 new units are going to be added as well, which will include some of the biggest weapons used in World War II, and which I also think are going to be the biggest pieces of artillery in Gates of Hell. Last but not least, aerial recon units are also going to be added. Now, whether they're going to be actual recon planes, such as the Focke-Wulf 189 Uhu or the famous Soviet PO-2, or if they're going to just repurpose existing fighter aircraft in the game, for that is currently not known. There's not been any screenshots, but it'll be interesting to see to what degree these will be usable. However, we do have the answer to that, so we'll get to that at the end of this video. A little bit of information, however, is also given on the new campaign missions, with the German ones taking place during the siege of Sevastopol and the battle for Narva, as well as fighting partisans in Yugoslavia and Germany's final offensive during World War II, Operation Spring Awakening, or Frühlingserwachen, hopefully I pronounced that correctly, in March of 1945. And for the Soviets, you can expect to see the Battle of Stalingrad as one of the missions, as well as something I am really excited for, the huge tank battle at Kursk. You can also command the first Ukrainian front liberating Kiev, as well as the Soviets pushing into the German Reich itself with the capture of Königsberg. Now, more units will be made available through this add-on, though none are specifically mentioned other than the huge Karl Mortar 600mm mortar. There are some screenshots, so we're going to take a look at some of those and see what we can discern from them. Most likely I will miss a thing or two, so feel free to point out what I either got wrong or missed in the comments down below. So this is clearly the infamous Jagdtiger, armed with a 128mm cannon, actually here being strafed by IL-2s, probably the most effective way of dealing with the Jagdtiger. Now personally, I'm not a huge fan of turretless vehicles, just because disabling a vehicle's tracks is rather easy in Gates of Hell or Men of War, especially with continued artillery fire, which then makes it a sitting duck. However, the power behind that 128mm gun might just be about worth it if you manage the tank very carefully. Now, probably one of the most famous units from the good old Rob's mod for Assault Squad 2 has to be the 600mm Karl Mortar, in this case, the one named Thor. This is basically a pocket nuke, and with very careful management, could actually turn the tide in any multiplayer game it was deployed in back in the day. Now, historically, these giant artillery pieces came with a crane and actually multiple rebuilt Panzer IV tank chassis to carry the huge 60mm shells that this thing fired. In the same picture, you can also see an up-armored Sdkfz 7, with what appears to be a 30mm flak in the back, though unarmored versions with ammo are seen in the picture as well. Another view of the Karl Mortar firing, which is actually a really neat shot with the shell and the massive fireball. However, I'd like to bring your attention to the transport infantry version of the Sdkfz 7 in the back, and as well as this little car next to that 222. After talking to my friend Davidson, and he mostly came up with the fact that it really appears to be a KFZ-13 in some sort of command or radio setup. Here we have a really awesome cinematic picture of what appears to be a T-34E with space armor, with some Yak fighters providing fire support, with a burning Panzer IV-H in the background. So one of the new German missions takes place in and around Sevastopol, and the Soviets had two fortresses there, nicknamed Maxim Gorky 1 and 2. Now these were eventually assaulted by German pioneers after the Karl Mortar managed to destroy one of the turrets of one of the fortresses, but it never managed to completely disable it. Now this could be a very interesting battle, considering these guns are 305mm twin barrels, and they're probably very well defended by other Soviet positions. Here we see some Soviets advancing along a trench line with a KV-8 flamethrower tank providing some flamethrower support. Now the interesting thing that I only recently learned is that the flamethrower took a lot of space in the turret. So the regular KV's gun, being a 76mm, had to be removed and exchanged for a smaller 45mm one. However, to try and not give away that this was a flamethrowing KV version, they actually tried to put the 45mm gun inside of the original 76mm gun's barrel, just trying to make it look like a regular KV until it started spewing flames everywhere. Here we see some German soldiers engaged in heavy urban fighting. Now this could be from the new Stalingrad mission from the Soviet side, or perhaps the liberation of Kiev. It does, however, mean that we're going to get some good CQB city warfare in this upcoming add-on. Here we see a column of German vehicles, but as far as I can see, two new ones. An Sdkfz 250-9, armed with a machine gun and a 20mm autocannon, which is sort of a half-track version of a 222. And then in front of that, we have the Sdkfz 234-3, which is armed with a machine gun and a short-barreled 75mm low-velocity infantry support gun. In this picture, we have a Soviet Jagdtiger being engaged by what looks to be an Ostwind self-propelled anti-aircraft tank, which is basically a Panzer IV chassis with a 37mm gun mounted in a very lightly armed turret. Now, besides being good at dealing with aircraft, I assume this will destroy infantry, light vehicles, and using the correct ammo, even the sides of quite heavy tanks that are taken by surprise. Now, after we just saw the Ostwind, here we have the Wirbelwind, which replaces the single 37mm with a quad barrel Flak-Vierling 20mm gun. Now, a little less effective against heavier vehicles, but much more deadly against infantry and light vehicles because of its higher rate of fire. The Soviets in-game have the heavy BS-3 100mm anti-tank gun, and now the Germans will be getting the Pak-43, which is the same gun found on the Nashorn, Jagdpanther, and Elephant tank destroyers, and this should actually be a decent surprise to unsuspecting Soviet tank crews, though I don't think this thing will last long under heavy enemy artillery fire. This next picture is a little bit cheeky because the attention is all on these two King Tigers in the front, but they're meant to distract you from that 234-4 Pakwagen in the background, which is a 234 armed with a 75mm Pak-40 mounted in a forward position. Now here it's a little bit of speculation because we do not have a great view of it, of a Maxim Gorky fortress and its guns. There appears to be an armored train wagon in the background, and it's not easy to see what the armament is, though I am familiar with at least one Soviet armored train wagon, which has multiple machine guns and two 45mm guns, which that one could potentially be, though I'm not 100% sure. So besides these pictures, there's also a little bit more information on these new doctrines, which I touched on at the beginning. And I'm a little worried though. It says that the new units will be available in the new doctrine and probably the new doctrines only. And I feel that could cause some pay-to-win issues between players who buy this DLC to play multiplayer and play the new doctrines versus people that play with the original doctrines. However, we're going to have to see how the developers balance these new doctrines versus the existing ones. These new support doctrines will have the ability to call in spotting or recon aircraft, which is going to help you pinpoint targets for friendly artillery or to recognize and exploit weak points in the enemy defensive lines. With a quick look at the new Gates of Hell Scorched Earth add-on, I hope you are excited as I am. I'm again hopefully going to be able to showcase you some early pre-public release gameplay, but for now, we're going to have to wait until that happens. I hope you enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.